Makahanya haramita shingyo Genji Saiboza Gyojin Hanya haramita Jishoken Gon Gai Guro Esai Gu Yaku Shari Shikifu.
Welcome back to our series on the 10 bull herding pictures, which is of course a spiritual analogy for the Zen training. We are now up to picture number 4, and this picture is entitled Catching the Bull. If we remember, in our last picture, picture number 3, the herdsman it's the first time that he actually sees the bull, and even then it's not in its entirety. All he sees is the hindquarters and that little wispy tail that almost seems to tease him, and the herdsman is running headlong towards the bull. Now in this picture we see that the bull is shown as in his entirety, and there he is, a magnificent creature. If we just take a look at that picture, here we still have our wilderness. This is our landscape. We have our herdsman, which we remember is not I or myself. The Buddha said that the self is an illusion. The herdsman represents the aspiration of the heart. It represents the humanity, if we like, because we remember that the Buddha said only from the human realm is liberation possible. So this is the human nature, this is the human aspiration, or the aspiration to full rounded humanity. Putting it Buddhistically, it's the aspiration in fact to Buddhahood, to enlightenment itself. And we see that there's this gradual process of a coming together, and this was mentioned right back in the first talk. To begin with, the bull is not in the landscape, then he begins to appear, and now there he is in his entirety. But my goodness, we can see, because there is that stout rope that connects the bull and the herdsman together, and we see that the bull is running one way and the herdsman is trying to pull him the other. And what is the bull? Well, the bull, of course, is my own heart, but it's my own wayward heart, the heart that is still ruled by elemental forces, by willfulness, by as the verse will put it, stubborn self-will rules his nature. And this is very much something we find ourselves in very much on an everyday basis. We have that decide to set our minds to do something, set ourselves up, and to begin with we have that beginner's enthusiasm, but that can quickly fade, and then suddenly the old habits come up, and my goodness are they strong. I mean, anybody who sat down to do meditation, say for half an hour, and we're given the instruction, say it's a meditation on the breath or a count on the breath, all we have to do is to just give ourselves into that count on the breath. And so we start 1, 2, 3. Now, he just said count the breath, but he didn't say how far I should count. Should I count to 10, or should I count to 20, or should I count to 50? 1, 2. I did see that video tutorial on learning meditation, and that said to actually use a mantra. So why doesn't he give me a mantra? Then I wouldn't have to think about what number to count. 1, 2. Oh dear, I don't seem to be able to get off to 1, 2, and so it goes on. It seems that no sooner have I tried to give myself into the object of meditation, suddenly, because I have no recollection when the thinking starts, of course, 5 minutes later I suddenly realize I've been gone off on some long daydream, and after a while I begin to feel that it's all rather futile and want to give up. And sometimes that's exactly what happens. And of course, when it comes to daily life practice, the mindfulness practice of giving myself wholeheartedly, exactly the same thing happens, which in a way is why people like to concentrate on sitting meditation when they come to Buddhism, and particularly Zen. because it's something I can do. It sort of seems a definite thing, whereas the daily life practice can often feel rather vague. Why? Because it's so hard to do. And why is it so hard to do? Because stubborn self-will rages, and so quickly I am off the mark and distracted once more. And we can really see this tussle going on in this picture here. But my goodness, the one thing that's very, very clear is just look at, even though the herdsman's further away from us and the bull is nearer to us, actually we shouldn't be fooled. That herdsman is still tiny compared to the bull. And all the way through, the bull is always bigger than the herdsman. And my goodness, isn't this what it feels like when we do spiritual practices in this way? We feel that we're fighting an uphill struggle into a strong headwind as well. And we may think that, well, what's the point? You know, that tiny, weedy herdsman, no way can he ever control the bull, because this is what I now think I must do. I must control the bull. But that's where I go completely off the mark, because control is very much an I-centered thing. And actually the bull is not to be controlled. The bull is to be gentled. And to gentle the bull means, of course, gentling the herdsman. Bulls are mammals, like we humans are mammals. And mammals, being warm-blooded creatures, are strong creatures of feeling. And not only are we strong creatures of feeling, but also we tend to have our feelings become rather infectious. If I'm feeling something and I come into a room and there are other people there, it can begin to rub off onto others, and vice versa as well. I mean, people who've got pets will know that their cat or their dog knows perfectly well how they're feeling. And sometimes I can come through the door if I've had a hell of a day, and the dog comes rushing up towards me, wags his tail, he takes one look at me, puts his tail between his legs, turns round and slinks away. There's no way he's coming near me, not in this mood. He picks it up straight away. So those two are very connected, the bull and the herdsman. Remember, they're just two sides of exactly the same heart. Although they appear separate, they're not separate. And it's the same with us too. Although we often find ourselves feeling in opposition to what's going on into the heart. Actually, myself and the heart are simply two aspects of the one thing, like the palm and the back of the same hand. So here we have them. Now, the important thing here is that the bull obviously appears in his entirety, although we cannot see the front part of him. We can only see the back part. And interestingly, there's a Zen koan that I'm reminded of with this. Comes from the Mumon Kan collection by Master Mumon, and it concerns a water buffalo passing a window, and it says that the horns, and the magnificent horns and the head of the buffalo, and the forelegs and the body of the buffalo, and the hind quarters of the buffalo can all pass the window, but the little wispy end of the tail, that cannot pass through the window. And of course the question is, why can't it pass through the window? And now we begin to approach something. We begin to go beyond the purely psychological, because up until now a lot of what we've been talking about has been really very psychologically oriented, and a lot of the modern psychologists now, which take a lot of their inspiration, it has to be said, from Eastern thought and Eastern psychology, very much has a lot of the same sort of similar things going on as we have here. So now we enter upon the sacred, and with the sacred, of course, there's something unlike with the psychological, which can always be described. There comes a point where, in fact, we go beyond what can be put into words and concepts. I mean, we remember that the Buddha's own experience, when he awoke, sitting under the Bodhi tree, he continued sitting there in contemplation, because what he had seen could not be expressed, and therefore how could it be taught? And it was only when he the great god Brahma came down and asked him to teach those whose eyes were but little covered with dust, that he realized that he could at least teach the way to the same insight. The way, the path, the map can be all laid out, which it is, of course, in the Buddha's teaching. But the actual living experience of it, that cannot be put into words. And it's the same with this heart nature as well. Ultimately, what it is cannot be put into words, and this is why in the end we put our hands together and we bow before it, because it's greater than I. It's greater than anything that I can control. Obviously, if I cannot even describe it, then I certainly cannot grasp it in any way, shape or form. And this is true also about our nature as well. Useful to remember now, because knowledge and information being so important, and it is so important, but there is something that lies beyond that, and it's a sense of the presence of that something that lies beyond that really is the cornerstone of the spiritual, which is, of course, spiritual is discarnate, something that has no body, and of course even a thought body is a body. There's a nice story I remember hearing about one of the research stations on the Antarctic that was used for studying the emperor penguins, those huge flocks of emperor penguins that live on the ice sheets. And normally they studied them just during the summer months. In the winter months they went back to the mainland, and the story starts with the group of scientists being in the helicopter on the way back to the mainland, when one of them turns to the other and said, "You did remember to bring the cat, didn't you?" And the other said, "No, I thought you had him." And they looked at each other and realized that they'd forgotten Ginger the cat. And it was too late, they couldn't go back. So they basically thought, well, that's it, curtains for the cat. And so when they returned again in spring, they were not particularly looking forward to what they would find. But when they came to the research station and they looked around, they couldn't find him. But there was a cat flap, so he could go out. And they thought, well, he must have just died somewhere on the ice sheet after all. What hope could he possibly have in that perpetual winter darkness? And so they set out with the job that they had come to do, and so they went out onto the ice sheets themselves, and they were observing the herds from a distance, when, looking through his binoculars, one of the researchers said, "Have you seen that ginger penguin there?" And the other one looked, and they realized that it wasn't a ginger penguin. It was Ginger the cat. And remarkably, the cat had managed to find the one place in the Antarctic that it might just be possible to survive. Huddled together for warmth. Obviously the penguins don't recognize the cat because he's not part of that landscape, and so they don't know that he's a predator, and if the odd egg or the odd chick might disappear, they wouldn't really be any the wiser. Of course, he lost a bit of his tail and some claws through frostbite, but apart from that, he was unharmed. And it's remarkable, you know. I mean, a cat is a creature from a much more temperate climate, and yet even in that alien climate, that inborn nature had managed to find the one place where he might survive. And perhaps for a cat owner, might not be surprised, because a cat will naturally gravitate to the warmest spot in the room. It just seems to know instinctively where it is, and there it stays, and that saves it. And this is what our nature can do. Remarkable things. Of course, we can say, well, it's, you know, this, that, and the other, and so forth. But it's the concatenation. It's the whole thing as it comes together and just emerges and manifests in the moment. That really is something that cannot be put into words. And just again on that, because now that's in the sort of cat realm, coming back to the human realm. I remember my own teacher, Myokyo-ni, saying that her teacher, Master Sesso, was once describing just this point about the most important things cannot be put into words. And she remembers saying to him, yes, you're absolutely right. And he said, no, he said, you do not understand. He said, the most important things really cannot be put into words. He said, take, for example, the heart of the devotee who goes to the Shinto shrine. Shintoism, of course, being the native nature religion in Japan. He said standing at the shrine, you put your money into the box, you pull the rope which rings the bell which tells the spirit, the kami, that you've come to pay its respects, and there's a box in front of you where the kami is supposed to appear. Well, of course the kami is invisible, so you can't see him even if he was there, but at that moment the true devotee puts his hands together and bows before the spirit. And he said it's what happens in the heart of the devotee. That is the true blessing that he came for from the spirit. And what is more, that cannot be put into words. So this is our picture. The bull, magnificent creature, there he is, and yet there's something about him that cannot be put into words too. And so that reverence is so important, so essential on this path. And now we have the accompanying verse. For the first time today he encountered the bull that for so long had been hiding in the wilderness. But his pleasantly familiar wilderness still attracts the bull strongly. He yearns for the sweet-smelling grass and is difficult to hold. Stubborn self-will rages in him, and wild animal nature rules him. If the herdsman wants to make the bull really gentle, he must discipline him with the whip. So this is fighting talk. Very much we are here at and really the verse very much just echoes what that picture is about. And this is why when we come into a training such as this, and for example, and particularly in Zen has a bit of a reputation for tough discipline, and there's a reason for that. Zen, after all, the Zen way, promises realization in this very life, and so that means it's going to be pretty energetic, and that means that the containment of those elemental forces also has to equal and match. As was said earlier, it's not the herdsman that gentles the bull. It's not the herdsman that controls the bull. Actually, the gentling process is very much a two-way thing. And if the herdsman wishes to come together with the heart, and from our point of view, yes, we want to taste the experience of our own source of life, our own living heart, of course we do. When we get caught up in a new fad, or we want something, the latest fashionable thing, it promises us that vitality, it promises us that sense of satisfaction and fulfillment in the getting of it, and then we get it, and it does for a while, but then things move on, and that feeling of vitality fades away, and then it gets projected out onto the next thing, and so we go chasing after that. This was the diagnosis that the Buddha gave us. This is the Four Noble Truths, suffering and the link to a sticky attachment. And of course, actually, really what we're after is the experience of our own heart, the realization of our own heart, which is, of course, what this path is about, which is what realizing the Buddha nature is about as well. So in this, what we don't realize is that whereas I always think it's about me getting hold of something, in other words, this is where the control comes in. Actually, what we don't recognize is that from the other side, the heart also wants to come together with the herdsman. You know, the bull is always going to be bigger, always. Unless the bull volunteers to come to the herdsman, this gentling process cannot work, because the herdsman does not have the strength. The bull has the strength. Fortunately, the bull does want to come together with the herdsman, but, and there is a big but here, the herdsman is weaker, and the question for the bull is, why should I trust you? Why should I trust that you can cope with me? And so the bull is constantly testing the herdsman, and this is where the discipline comes in. What wins the bull over in the end is not brute force, neither is it any form of controlling behavior. The one thing that wins the bull over more than anything else is sincerity, the sincerity of the herdsman in his aspiration to come together with the bull. In the end, it's that humility, but that sincerity of heart that will draw the bull towards him. The bull, though, is going to test him every single step of the way, because that's how sincerity is tested, through acts of faith like this. And so this means that the discipline has to be good, and for the discipline to be good, it means that the student has to trust the process. The student has to trust the practice. And in the monastic environment, in a teaching environment such as a training temple or a monastery, for example, that means from the student complete obedience. Now, obedience is not a word that's very popular these days, but the Zen way is reliant on it. It's very central. Interesting, though, to note that the meaning of obedience means simply to listen, to be able to listen carefully. Now, I might think, well, yes, that's what I always do. I just listen, and then you tell me how to do it, and then I will get on with it. But it's not quite like that. Take, for example, about learning how to ride a bike. Okay, let's say I go to somebody and I say, look, I can't ride a bike, but I'd like to learn how to ride a bike. And the teacher goes, okay, well, here's a bike. So the first thing you need to do is to get onto it. And I go, well, okay, how do I get onto it? And so he describes, you've got to swing your leg over, sit on the saddle. Okay, I can do that. And hold the handlebars so it's steady. And all you're going to do is to put your feet onto the pedals and start pedaling. How do I do that? Well, you sort of push off with the back leg, and then with both feet on the pedals, you just pedal. And you do it. But how do I actually balance on the bike? Well, that's the bit that can't really be put into words. It's sort of trial and error. I see. Well, so I might fall off the bike. Yes, I might fall off the bike. Well, I could hurt myself. Well, you haven't got too far to fall, and perhaps if you do it on this grass here, you won't really hurt yourself. Well, I'm not sure about that. There must be another way to do this, and so I go off and I look on the internet and I learn all about bikes, and I learn all about aerodynamics and engineering and how the bike's put together and the physics of it, but I still can't ride a bike, even though I know everything about it, and I know the science behind it and so forth. And I always feel frustrated, and I always feel that it's somebody else's fault. If only people could tell me exactly what I need to do, because I don't want to fall off. And it's the same also with meditation and with mindfulness practice as well. I want to get it right. I don't like being corrected. I don't want to think that I'm going to make mistakes, and yet actually the Zen way demands that we do make them. When we go into a Zen temple or a Zen monastery, actually very few instructions are given. Not only is the listening necessary for the obedience, but also the close observation as well, looking very closely and being able to fit in with everybody else, which again is something that I don't particularly like to do. I like to do things my own way. And not only do I like to do things my own way, when I'm being taught, I want those teachings specifically for me. Yes, everyone else might do it that way, but actually I'm special, and so I need slightly special treatment. That goes through quite a lot, particularly for us Westerners, and is a big problem actually when it comes to the Zen training, because A, we don't like to listen, B, we don't really like doing as we're told, and C, we lack that faith. We lack that faith in the teacher, and we're not talking now about, I know there's all sorts of accusations, and have been all sorts of really bad stories coming out of certainly some of the sort of Western teaching places as well, and it behoves us to select carefully and to keep both eyes open as well. But once we've found somewhere, and once we've found someone whom we trust, then we should trust them, that they're going to teach us. After all, there's no point going to a teacher saying, teach me, and then refusing to do as we're told. We're wasting everybody's time. So with that obedience, with that trust, and there's something else as well, actually. The inability to trust others also indicates an inability to trust myself. And again, coming back to this issue of control, which for a lot of people is a big, big issue. You know, we talk about control freaks and we joke about it. But it's a big issue for many of us. We're frightened to hand ourselves over. You know, we talk about the heart of this practice being to give myself wholeheartedly into what at this moment's being done. And I think, well, it's just so easy. I could just do it, you know. But the real problem with handing myself over is that I don't really want to. I'm frightened. That trust is not there. And this is why Buddhism has always been taught face-to-face, because it's necessary to build up trust in others, whether it's other people, whether it's in the situation, whether it's in the process of life and death, whether it's in nature, doesn't really matter. We need that faith, and this is what that faith, and faith is not just blind faith either. Blind faith is just blind belief. Blind faith is built up through trial and error. We develop faith in things because we try them out and we realize that they do work, and then we try them out again and they do work. And when we discover that something truly supports, then that handing over will happen quite naturally. But it does mean that we've got to make that an initial leap of faith. Carefully, yes, but we must do that. So that handing over really is necessary. Why? Because this pleasantly familiar wilderness still attracts the bull strongly. He yearns for the sweet-smelling grass and is difficult to hold. And therefore, we really will need that containment. We need to trust the process. There's a nice story that comes from the Eastern Jewish tradition about an old, irascible man, an angry old man. He had a hot temper, and everyone knew he did. And every so often, he would explode. And then he would do something or say something, and then when it was all over, he would be full of recrimination, self-recrimination, and vowing that he would never do it again. And then a little bit of time would go by, and then the whole process would repeat itself. Anyway, one day, his son-in-law borrowed the old man's pen without asking, and the man was so furious that he actually struck his son-in-law. And when he calmed down, he was so horrified by what he had done, he realized he must do something. So the son-in-law actually said to him, look, he said, there's a famous rabbi coming to a nearby town. Why don't you go and have a consultation with him? So both of them went together, and they arrived, and the old man was ushered in to see the rabbi. And 15 minutes later, he came out fulminating, saying to his son-in-law, it was a ridiculous idea of yours. This man is an idiot. The son-in-law said, well, what did he suggest? He said, always speak politely. Well, I'm no hypocrite. If something needs to be said, I will say it. And had another fulmination. Anyway, they both went back home. There were a couple more rather explosive episodes, and the old man thought, well, he'd better do something. And this was the only advice that he had, so he thought he'd better try it. So he started his practice. He gave himself into that practice to always speak politely. And what's more, obviously there is a few trial and errors, but he managed it. And after not a too long period of time, everybody else began to notice that he was really making the effort. And now he was beginning to succeed. And people were impressed. Because, of course, people admire inner strength. And it takes inner strength to really stick to a discipline like that, a simple discipline like that. And not only that, if those other people had problems, whereas before they kept away from him because they were rather frightened of him, they came to him because they wanted to know how he acquired that strength. And he was able to help them too. And the story sort of culminates one sort of in those sort of cold Central European winters when the snow was thick on the ground, and the postman comes in early morning, snow piled up on his boots, and as he walks in, all the snow falls off on the newly cleaned kitchen floor. And the old man looks at the postman, looks down at the increasing puddle of water that the postman is standing in that melted snow, and looks back at the postman and through slightly gritted teeth says, "It must be rather cold outside." Yes, well, it certainly is. And this is how it has to go. This is why also the entrance begging in the monasteries are so tough. And in the first year or so, the new monks, and by monks it can be men and women, the new monks are given a hell of a time. Real hell of a time. They are being tested and tested and tested. Can they hold together in the form without exploding out, or without becoming overwhelmed inwardly either? Can they really live out the onslaughts of those emotional onslaughts? And if they can, then remarkably the onslaughts begin to get less. I remember talking to a monk once who was very close to a teacher. He was the a personal assistant, and my goodness did he used to get it. He really used to get it. And I remember saying to him once, how do you manage it? And he said, well, at first, he said, it was awful. He said something would happen, I'd be yelled at, and I would be fulminating over it for 3 days. But he says now, no more than 10 minutes. It's not that I now hold myself against it or stubbornly refuse or something like that. That's just more anger, but in a slightly different direction. No, it goes right through. There's nothing for that to get hold of. One sees if one's made a mistake and one simply corrects it. There's no long recriminations, no fury and revenge or depression or feelings of self-worth or whatever. It just goes straight through one, and one just simply carries on. This is the power of the form, and the form has really been developed, and that containment strength is really there. Then the fear of these situations go, and in the absence of that fear, the heart is released. We don't realize just how prevalent fear is in us, how it forces us. We think that we're free when we get what we want, but actually we're not. We become more and more frightened of not getting what I want, and that really cramps our style. Once we're free to have what we want, and once we're free to not get what we want, then there's nothing that need frighten us anymore. We can go. As Soka Roshi once said, when a student comes to me, the first thing I check for is, does he have a problem? If he doesn't have a problem, then I give him one as quickly as I can. And my only job after that is simply to make that problem worse and worse and worse until the student finally drops it. Then it's all over. He can go. See how the emphasis is? Actually, with those things, it's always about the letting go. It's always, why do I have these problems? Because I won't let them go. I will not accept things as they actually are. And because of that, because I must have things to suit myself, then that stubborn self-will continues to rage in him because I'm determined to have my own way. And wild animal nature rules him. Snorts up. If the herdsman wants to make the bull really gentle, he must discipline him with that whip, which of course does sound rather frightening, but actually also we shouldn't forget too that in that discipline there is also the right motivation. There is that warmth. If I begin to hate, if I fall into the error of anger and hating even particularly my own heart, then we can end up becoming what's known as bull men or bull women. That is, we have that strength, but it's now ruled by I. And instead of that I being gentled and softened up until finally it slips away and is forgotten, and then the heart truly opens, it goes the other way. And the bull, the elemental quality, begins to rule, and the humanity now gets crushed. And that is a very dangerous thing indeed. We only have to look into our history. Well, we don't even have to look into our history. We can read the papers to see what happens when that wild, elemental, divine or semi-divine energy, my goodness, when that comes out and is unrestrained, then it's best just to get out of the way as quickly as possible. So there we are, with our picture, Catching the Bull. It's a tough time yet, and it won't be over for a little while, but for now, we'll end this talk there.